And Dr. Sandy, I should. Shabbat Shalom. We're just a couple minutes past 6, and I know, or 8, excuse me. It seems so bright out there. I said it has to be 6. I suspect we'll see a few more people continuing to make their way in. But I do want to get us started with services tonight. We are on page 10 of our Siddur for Yedid Nefesh. And I'll say this week, as we come to, it's right now. It's the 8th of Av, and we're leaning into the 9th of Av tonight as one day passes into the next. And of course, our Tisha B'Av fast is put off by a day on account of Shabbat. And while certainly I have some remarks about Tisha B'Av, which I'll share tomorrow, I think it's a nice reminder that whatever may be bothering us or troubling us as we head into Shabbat is something we can put aside for a little while. And if we absolutely have to, come back to later. But we as we think of that, we turn to the words of Yedid Nefesh on page 10, and we begin our Kabbalat Shabbat here together in song. Yedid Nefesh av harachaman Mishoch avdach el retzonach Yarutz avdach kmo ayal Yishachave mul hadarach Ki yerav lo yedidutach Minof etzuf vechotam Hadur nae ziv haolam nafshi cholat avatach ana il narfanalach beharot lach noam zivach as titchazek vetitrapei V'hayetalach shivchat olam V'tik yehemu rachamecha V'chusna al ben ohavach Ki ze kama nichsof nichsaf Liro b'tiferet uzach Ana ili mahmad libi Chushana ve'al tit'alam Higalena ufros chaviv alai Et sukat shelomach Ta'ir eretz mikvodach Nagila v'nismecha bach Mahir ahuv kiva moed v'choneini ki me'olam Yadadai dai dahi dai Yadadai dai dahi dai Yadadai dai 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 Yadadai dai dai Yadadai dai dai Yadadai dai dai Yadadai dai 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 Yadadai dai dai Yadadai dai dai Yadadai dai dai Yadadai dai 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 Yadadai dai dai Yadadai dai dai Yadadai dai dai Yadadai dai dai. We turn to pages 11 and 12 for Psalm 95. We begin together with L'chu Neranena, and we'll conclude individually on our own after that. L'chu Neranena l'Adonai, Nariya letzur Ishenu Nikadma fanav betoda Bizmirot naryalog. Arbaim shana akut bedor va'omaram to'e levavhem vehem lo yadu drachai asher nishbati ve'apim yavo'un al menuchati. Page 13, Psalm 96. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash, shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz, shiru l'Adonai baruchu shemo, basru miyom liyom yeshuato, sapru v'goyim kevodo, bechol ha'amim nifleotav. Ki gadol Adonai umehulal meod, norahu al kol Elohim, ay ki kol Elohe ha'amim elilim, v'Adonai shamayim asa, hod v'hadar lefanav, oz v'tiferet b'mikdasho, havu l'Adonai mishpachot amim, havu l'Adonai kavod va'oz, havu l'Adonai kevod shemo, se'u mincha uva'u lechatzrotav, v'idai ishtachavu l'Adonai behadrat kodesh, chilu mipanav kol haaretz, imru v'goyim Adonai malach, avtikon tevel bal timot, yadin amim b'meisharim, yismachu hashamayim v'tagil haaretz, yiram hayam umlo ya'alo sadai v'chol asher bo, ay az yiranenu kol anse ya'ar lifnei Adonai kiva lishpot haaretz, yishpot tevel betzedek ve'amim be'emunato, We'll continue with the next psalm on page 15, which we'll read in the English on pages 15 and 16. Let's see, Matt, would you come up and lead us? That way we've got the mic and we've got you, and there we go. Pages 15 and 16.
Adonai reigns, let the earth be glad, let the many distant lands rejoice. Clouds and thick darkness surround the divine, righteous and justice secure God's throne. Fire goes before God, consuming of besiegers round about. Flashes of lightning illumine the land, the earth watches and trembles. Mountains melt like wax at the approach of Adonai, at the approach of the Master of all of the earth. Glory, and nations see God's glory. Worshippers of idols, be shamed for praising false gods. All that is deemed supreme, bow low before God. The cities of Judah exalt Adonai past judgment. You, Adonai, are above all that is earthly, exalted over all that is worshipped as divine. Adonai hate evil. God protects the lives of the faithful, saving them from the hands of the sinful. Light is sown for the righteous, and joy for the upright. Rejoice in Adonai, you righteous people, and thank God as you pronounce the divine holy name.
The next psalm we'll do individually, and we'll conclude on we'll read pages 17 and 18 individually. Mizmor shiru l'Adonai shir chadash, ki niv l'rasa, hoshia lo yamino, zeror kodsho. Ariel. Lifnei Adonai kiva lishpot haaret, yishpot tevel betzedek ve'amim b'meisharim. We'll begin this psalm individually, and we'll conclude with some singing. We begin on page 19, and we'll conclude with Romamu on page 20. Adonai malach yirgezu amim yoshev kruvim tanut haaret. Adonai b'tzion levu. Please join me at the red triangle on page 20. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu lehar kodsho. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu lehar kodsho. Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu. Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu lehar kodsho. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu lehar kodsho. Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu. Page 21, Psalm 29, Mizmor LeDavid. Mizmor LeDavid, havu l'Adonai b'nei Elim, havu l'Adonai kavod va'oz, havu l'Adonai kivod shemo, ishtachavu l'Adonai behadrat kodesh. Kol Adonai al hamayim el hakavod hirim, Adonai al mayim rabim. Kol Adonai ba'koach, Kol Adonai behadar, Kol Adonai shover arazim, v'yeshaber Adonai et arzei ha'levanon. Vayarkidem kmo egel Levanon v'Sirion, kmo ven re'emim. Kol Adonai chotzei lahavot eish, Kol Adonai yachil midbar, yachil Adonai midbar kadesh. Kol Adonai yachol elayalot, vayechsof ye'arot, uveichalo kulo omer kavod, kulo omer kavod. Adonai lamavul yashav, vayeshev Adonai melech leolam, Adonai oz le'amo yiten, Adonai yevarech et amo v'shalom. We'll turn to page 23. So we continue with Lecha Dodi. And you'll, those of you who frequently attend Tisha B'Av services will recognize one of the tunes that's used here. The other one should be familiar to everybody anyway. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. שמור וזכור בדיבור אחד השמיענו, אל המיוחד אדוני אחד ושמו אחד, לשם ולתפארת ולתהילה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לקראת שבת לכו ונלך, כי מקור הברכה מראש מקדם, נסוכה סוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. מקדש מלך עיר מלוכה, קומי יצאים מתוך ההפכה. רב לך שבט בעמק הבכה, והוא יחמול עלייך חמלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. התנערי מעפר קומי, לבשי בגדי תפארתך עמי. על יד בן ישי בית הלחמי, קרבה אל נפשי גאלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. התעוררי התעוררי, כי באורך קומי אורי אורי אורי, שיר דברי, כבוד אדוני עלייך נגלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לא תבושי ולא תקלמי, מה תשתוכחי ומה תהמי. בך יחסו עניי עמי, ונבנתה עיר אל תילה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. והיו למשיס שוסייך, ורחקו כל מבלייך. יסיס עלייך אלוהיך, כמשוש חתן על כלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. ימין ושמאל תפרוצי, ואת אדוני תריצי. על יד איש בן פרצי, ונשמחה ונגילה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. בואי בשלום עטרת בעלה, גם בשמחה ובצהלה. תוך אמוני עם סגולה, בואי חלה, בואי חלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. We continue on page 27 and 28 with Psalm 92. מזמור שיר ליום השבת, טוב להודות לאדוני, וזמר לשמך עליון, וזמר לשמך עליון. להגיד בבוקר חסדך, ואמונתך בלילות. עלי עשור ועלי נבל, עלי היגיון בכינור. מזמור שיר ליום השבת, טוב להודות לאדוני. Adonai, ולזמר לשמך עליון, ולזמר לשמך עליון. כי שימחתני אדוני בפועלך, במעשה ידיך ארנן. מה גדלו מעשיך אדוני, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. מזמור שיר ליום השבת, טוב להודות לאדוני, ולזמר לשמך עליון, ולזמר לשמך עליון. צדיק כתמר יפרח, כארז בלבנון יזכה שתולים. בבית אדוני בחצרות אלוהינו יפריחו, עוד ינובון בשיבה. דשנים ורעננים יהיו להגיד, כי ישר אדוני סורי, ולא עוולת בו. Page 29 will read responsively on page 29, Psalm 93. Adonai is sovereign, robed in splendor, girded in strength. The earth stands firm, not to be dislodged. From earliest time you were enthroned. You are eternal. The rivers raise up their roar. The rivers raise up their waves. Above the majestic breakers of the ocean, Adonai stands supreme in the heavens. In your house, beautiful in its holiness, your testimonies endure, Adonai, for all time. Kaddish Yatom Mourner's Kaddish is found on page 30. If you are reciting Mourner's Kaddish, is anyone here reciting Mourner's Kaddish? Please join me at this time. Yit Gadal v'yit Kadash Shmei Rabba. Ba'alama divra kirutei v'amlich malchutei b'chayei chon v'yomei chon v'chayei l'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala u'bizman kariv v'imru amen. Yahei Shmei Rabba Mavarach la'alam v'lolamei alamaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnasei v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yithalal Shmei v'kudsha b'richu la'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata da'amiran ba'alama v'imru amen. Yahei Shalama Rabba min Shmaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Asay shalom b'mramah hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Please rise. Bobby, I was trying to catch you before you sat down. Please rise on page 39A as we begin our Mariv service together for Shabbat with Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam Va'ed. You may be seated. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bidbaro ma'ariv aravim b'chachma v'nefesh. Uma'avir yom u'mevi layla uma'avdil bein yom u'vein layla Adonai tzvaot shemo el chai v'kayam tamid yimloch aleinu le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai ha'ma'ariv aravim. Page 40. Let's read together in the English the second bracha before Shema. With timeless love you have loved your people, the house of Israel. You have taught us Torah and mitzvot, statutes and laws. Therefore, Adonai, our God, as we lie down and as we rise up, we shall speak of your laws, rejoicing in the words of your Torah and in your mitzvot forever and ever. For they are our life and the fullness of our days, and on them we shall meditate day and night. Do not withdraw your love from us. Baruch atah Adonai, who loves the people Israel. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. והיה... ויאמר אדוני יום משה לאמור דבר. Adonai Elohechem Emet. Now we continue with the next baracha at the top of page 43a, and it continues on page 44 after that. שבחו והודו לשמו ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה ומרים ובני ישראל לחנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני מי כמוך נדר בקודש נורא תהילות אוסף אלי ידי לילי ידי 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 מלכותך ראו בניך בוקע הים לפני משה זה אלי אנו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד ידי 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 ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום והעמידנו מלכנו לחיים ופרס עלינו שכן ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך ברוך אתה אדוני הפורש סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל ירושלים. Please rise as we continue on page 46 with V'shamaru. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם אלי ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ וביום השביעי שבת וינפש. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה קירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי לכל בית ישראל, בעגלה בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך, לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי קודשה בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו amen. Our service continues with silent Amidah beginning on page 47. Please be seated when you're done with your Amidah. We rise on page 53 for the symbolic recapitulation of the Amidah. ויחולו השמיים והארץ וכל צבאם ויחל אלוהים ביום השביעי מלאכתו אשר עשה וישפוט ביום השביעי מכל מלאכתו אשר עשה. ויברך אלוהים את יום השביעי ויקדש אותו, כי בו שבה מכל מלאכתו אשר ברא אלוהים לעשות. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, אלוהי אברהם, אלוהי יצחק ואלוהי יעקב, אלוהי שרה, אלוהי רבקה, אלוהי רחל ואלוהי לאה, האל הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, אל עליון, קונה שמיים וארץ, מגן אבות בדברו, מחיה מתים במאמרו, האל הקדוש שאין כמוהו, המניח לעמו ביום שבת קודשו, כי בם רצה להניח להם, כי בם רצה להניח להם, לפניו נעבוד ביראה ופחד, ונודה לשמו בכל יום תמיד, מעון הברכות. אל ההודעות אדון השלום, מקדש השבת ומברך שביעי, ומניח בקדושה לעמדו שני עונג, זכר למעשה בראשית. אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, רצה במנוחתנו, קדשנו במצוותיך, ותן חלקנו בתורתך, צבאנו מטובך, ושמחנו בישועתך, וטהר ליבנו לעבדך באמת, והנחילנו אדוני אלוהינו באהבה וברצון שבת קודשך, וינוחו בישראל מקדשי שמך. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת. יתגדל ויתקדש מרבה, ואלמד יברא קירותי וימליך מלכותי בחיי חון וביום חון וחי לכל בית ישראל בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה. בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירן בעלמה, ואמרו אמן. תתקבל צאתן וברכן לכל ישראל קדם אבהן דבי שמעיה, ואמרו אמן. יהי שלום הרבה מן שמעיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ויעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. סברי? ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר קידשנו במצוותיו ורצה בנו בשבת קודשו באהבה וברצון הנחילנו, זיכרון למעשה בראשית, כי הוא יום תחילה למקראי קודש, זכר ליציאת מצרים, כי בנו בחרת ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים, בשבת קודשך באהבה וברצון הנחלתנו, Baruch ata Adonai mekadesh ha-Shabbat. We remain standing on page 56 for Aleinu, page 56. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon ha'kol la'tet kedula li'otzer bereishit shelo asanu kegoyei ha'aratzot velo samanu k'mishpachot ha'adama shelo sam chelkenu kahem וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא, שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוסד הארץ, ומושב יקרו בשמיים ממעל, ושכינתו זו בגבי מרומים. הוא אלוהינו אין עוד, אמת מלכנו אפס זולתו, ככתוב בתורתו, וידעת היום והשבות אל לבבך, כי אדוני הוא האלוהים בשמיים ממעל, ועל הארץ מתחת אין עוד. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד, ושמו אחד. We turn now to Kaddish Tom on page 58. As we do, I want to note that let's see. May have another thought with this. Those are all last week's. I did too good a job cleaning up. So I don't have my list for Friday as well as Saturday. Technically, it may still be Friday out there. I can tell you that today, coming up, the 9th of Av, we'll be observing Yortzites of Helene Alexander and Agnes Roth, mother of Claire Lee, who's with us tonight. In addition, over the coming week, we'll also be observing the Yortzites of Benjamin Rack, Brina Gottesman, Marion Blaker, mother of Bobby Handwerker, who's with us, David Richards, Mendel Wolf, Abraham Roth, Rose Weiss-Wilker, Elaine Beagleson, Herbert Ross, Marvin Schechter, Tilly Nabolsky, Sanford Horties, father of John, who's with us tonight as well, Victor Amster, the paternal grandfather of our Vic Amster, Martin Ephros, Vivian Vance, Marvin Kirsch, and Pearl Carmel. In addition to these, we also think of those we've lost over the last year. Among them, Frank Grossman, George Fisher, Sal McCone, Lori Gupp, Ben Koff, Matt Yosefat, Peter Gabor, Sandy Richards, Kay Gaines, Irv Zipperstein, Elaine Nevins, Joan Dane, Eileen Chodesh, June Howard, Pam Simwitz-Weber, Hal Schneider, and Rosemary Bloom. If there's anyone else you're remembering tonight whom I didn't name and you'd like to share a name with us, I'll invite you to do so at this time. If you're reciting Kaddish, whether you're with us here or you're with us on the stream, please join with me. Yit Gadal v'yit Kadash Shmei Rabbah. Ba'alama divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayecho v'yomecho v'chayei l'chol beit Yisrael. Ba'agala u'bizman kariv v'imra amen. Yahei Shmei Rabbah mavarach l'alam u'lolamei alamaya. Yit barach v'yishtabach v'yit pa'ar v'yit ramam v'yit nasei v'yit hadar v'yit aleh v'yit halal Shmei v'kudsha b'richu. La'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tush bechata v'nechamata da'amiran ba'alama v'imra amen. Yahei shalama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imra amen. Asay shalom b'imromav hu ya'asay shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imra amen. Before we move on to announcements, we have a lighter and more celebratory. Announcements are light and celebratory, but also, we do want to note, as it's the first Friday of our month, something special that we celebrate, which is anniversaries in this month of August. On our list, and I don't have that. We've made a I don't know if it's diplomatic or what, but a change wherein we don't actually print the year, either perhaps not to embarrass, since we don't do that with birthdays, or maybe we just don't want to give anyone bragging rights over others. So I don't know within the number of years that each of these couples is celebrating at this time, except for one. We have celebrated already in the month of August the anniversary of Aaron and Dot Levinson, and that was on August 1st. Coming up soon on the 7th, that of Steve and Katie Carmel. On the 8th, that of Jane and Mark Carlsberg. On the 12th, Irv and B. Goodman. On the 13th, Michael and Betsy Scheffler, as well as Carol and Judy Miller. On the 18th, Myron and Jerry Fish. On the 19th, Maria Mason and Keith Bookbinder. On the 20th, Joe Lazier and Karen Kern Lazier are celebrating 50 years. We know that because they're throwing us a lunch. On the 22nd, Debbie Slavitt Fisher and Olivia Fisher. 26th, Steffi and Barry Kogan. On the 27th, Lois and Mike Seidenman. 28th, Rabbi Samantha and Jason Shapira celebrate their, let's see, do I know how long they've been married? I think it's 6. And on the 30th, Ari Cohen and Debbie Carmel. So that's two big celebrations for the Carmel clan this month. So Mazal Tov to all of those. In case you're wondering, it is not a record. This is not the first time that we have that I've read these out and not had anybody in the kahal who was celebrating an anniversary, unless I missed someone. Is anybody else here celebrating an anniversary? You have an anniversary to celebrate this month. The 19th of August. Can I ask how many years? 46 years. Sorry? 47. Okay, 47. I'm trying to do something with that. I've got a Mem and a Zion. I don't really know. Yeah, Lizam Zem comes to mind. There's a lot of buzzing and humming. Either that's an engine hard at work, or you drown out the noise of whatever it is your partner is saying. Either way, both are good. Both are a good ticket to a functioning, healthy relationship. So that's not rabbinic advice. That's just me trying to deliver off-the-cuff humorous remarks. So Mazal Tov to all of these families who are celebrating this year, and Dr. Cora, Sandy, to you and yours as well. Before I introduce Sandy Koras to everyone, Dr. Alexander Koras, whose bona fides you may have already read in the announcements that have gone out about her as our first Friday speaker. Just a couple of additional announcements that we have for the week. Shabbat services will continue tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. or resume tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. And they will be preceded by Talmud study at 8:45. So if you want to show up early, break your teeth on some rabbis' names and some even denser ideas about jurisprudence in the ancient world, we're studying Tractate Sanhedrin, and it's a fun time will be had by all. There's coffee, if that's an extra added incentive. We have, there is a choir practice this Sunday no choir practice this Sunday. Wow, Tisha B'Av, right? I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm doing the math. I decided that Tisha B'Av was happening on another day. No choir practice this Sunday. Hopefully it's not on the calendar. I have to double check and make sure. Shouldn't be on the calendar. And next Sunday at 1 o'clock or 5 o'clock? Are they all 1 o'clock from here on? 1 o'clock from here on. Okay, good. Okay, and because I had that wrong last week, and I wanted to make sure I didn't do that again. And besides that, our Tisha B'Av service is tomorrow night at 9:35. And you may ask yourself, why 9:35? Why would you start at such a strange time? And the answer is so that I have time to make Havdalah, hop in my car, and drive over here. That is the answer to that question. So we will start, and I believe we will be holding those services in the chapel. We don't tend to use the chapel much, but unless we are in a standing room only capacity, which is funny because we'll be sitting on the floor, we will be there. So if you will come, it's sedate, it's peaceful. I know there's a lot of mourning associated with Tisha B'Av, but I don't think there needs to be too much self-affliction. I think it's actually a very introspective holiday, and it's a good opportunity for reflection, and I encourage all to come. Yeah, save your self-affliction for Yom Kippur, please. So, and besides that, we will also have Tisha B'Av services Sunday morning, starting at 9 a.m. So, anything else, any other big announcements that we need to make sure? Frank, new movie night? 7 p.m. next Sunday, so that's on the, I have to do the math. What's it called? What's it called? Making Trouble, a film about 6 Jewish comedians. Very good. And Bobby? Next Sunday, 14th, 10:15, Sisterhood Book Group in the morning. So 10:15 in the morning, 7 p.m. at night. We've got you covered for programming next Sunday. Okay, then with that, we will conclude on page 60. Page 61, 62, with Yigdal. Let's see. There we go, 62. Yigdal Elohim chai ve'yishtabach nimtza ve'ein et el mitziuto echad ve'ein yachid ki yichudo ne'elam v'gam ein sof le'achduto ein lo dmut haguf ve'eino guf lo na'aroch elav kedushato kadmon l'chol davar asher nivra rishon ve'ein reshit le'reshito hino adon olam v'chol notzar yoreh gdulato u'malchuto shefa nevuato netano el anshe segulato v'tifarto lo kam b'Yisrael k'Moshe od navi u'mabid et tmunato Torah temed natan le'amo el al yad nevio neman beito lo yachalif ha'el ve'lo yamir dato le'olamim le'zulato sofe ve'yodea setarenu מביט בסוף דבר בקדמתו, גומל לאיש חסד כמפעלו, נותן לרשע רע כרישתו, ישלח לקץ ימין משיחנו, לפדות מחכה קץ ישועתו, מתים יחיה אל ברוב חסדו, ברוך הדי עד שם תהילתו, מתים יחיה אל ברוב חסדו, ברוך הדי עד שם תהילתו. That concludes our service, and I don't know if I'm introducing someone who's introducing Dr. Koras or if I am introducing her. If I'm introducing you, I only know what I've read in emails and heard from people, which is that Dr. Sandy Koras is a professor emerita of Russian history, lately of Xavier University. How long were you at Xavier? 31 years. That is. That's more than half your marriage. It's a healthy percentage of it in any case. And she's got some information to share with us that is hopefully relevant, informative, and historical, certainly historical if nothing else, in the context of what a lot of us are thinking about with Ukraine and Russia on our minds, given the conflict there right now. And I do have some maps here. A bunch of maps, and I think should I hold on to these until you want them passed around?
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Obviously, in Shabbat you don't do that.
Right.
This is sort of a substitute for it.
Got it.
I'm glad they're in color because I have black and white ones that are very hard to read.
I could imagine. Okay. So we'll hang on to these up here until they're.
What I'll do is I'll show all of you and then you can pass them around.
Got it. Okay. Whenever you're ready.
I'm ready. Okay, well, let me start. Sure. I started doing this in February. I was sitting with one of my former colleagues at Xavier and at lunch, and I was explaining to her what was going on, and it was on the 23rd of February, and as you know, the Russians invaded Ukraine on the 24th, and suddenly I had a gig. So I've done this several times with more maps than I've included here, but I thought it was important to tell the story of what these relationships are. And I want to start, the maps are sort of in the wrong order, so I'm going to have to pull them out. But the first map, which is in the back of this packet, is a map that goes back to the 9th century. We start the story of Russian history with Ukraine.
Sandy, can I suggest
Sure.
pass the maps out right now?
Okay, please do. I'm going to keep one of them and just but I'm going to tell you what order they're in with that.
We'll figure it out.
Okay, I will. Okay, I'm going to keep it set.
Got it.
Okay. All right. And for those of you who are far, I apologize that I walked away from the mic. The first map, which is the one in the back, okay, is a map which goes back to the 9th century, the beginning of Russian history, and technically the beginning of Ukrainian history begins according to the primary chronicle, which is the story that both Ukrainians and Russians tell, it's just that they spell the names differently. You're going to have to pass some, the maps, there's bunches of maps you have to pass them to the other side as well. Otherwise, judges. Okay, so there were several packets. You have to share. I'm sorry.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. So start from the back and then push them around again. I'm sorry. All right, and I'll pass this one around. This map is a map of the routes of the Vikings to Constantinople. The Vikings, we know about the Vikings on the western part of Europe. They would call them the Normans. They contributed a province to France called Normandy. In the 11th century, they very conveniently invaded the British Isles, particularly England. They changed the way the language is spoken. As a result, we speak English partly because of the Viking influence. They invaded the British Isles in people whom we now call the Danes. But they did the same in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, Vikings were called Varangians, and in the 9th century, just about the time that they were wreaking havoc in Western Europe, they proceeded to come into the areas that today we call Russia and Ukraine. And they established a trading post in a city which we call Novgorod, and then connecting Novgorod, which means new city, they proceeded to get to the Dnieper River, and they apparently stopped in the area around which is Kiev today. And according to the primary chronicle, like all good chronicles, it was written 300 or 400 years later, so it's really about a legend. It's the back map in the packet. Slavic tribes in the area looked at these Vikings, the head of whom was a guy named Rurik, and they asked if they would please organize and civilize the Slavs. Later on, this became, especially during Stalinist times, a very bad thing to have been done, so they tried to change the history, but this is the legend. And so in the 9th century, around the year 860 or 862, these Vikings established a trading post in the area which is present-day Kiev, or Kiev, depending. I speak Russian. I don't speak Ukrainian, so most of the words that I'm going to say will come out in Russian, not in Ukrainian. And from Kiev, they proceeded down the Dnieper, and they got to the area of the city of what is present-day Kherson, and from Kherson, they crossed the Black Sea to Constantinople, the most important, or one of the 2 or 3 most important cities in all of Europe, and certainly the capital at the time of the Byzantine Empire. And these routes were very important to the Vikings. They would bring with them all sorts of products that were traded in Constantinople that were forest products, like honey and hides and so forth. And Kiev became the main city from where they organized the trade that came from the north, further south across the Black Sea to Constantinople. So within 120 years, Kiev was established as this important center, and at about the year 988, according to the chronicle, the prince of Kiev, whose name was Vladimir if you're Russian, Volodymyr if you're Ukrainian, and probably Valdemar if you were a Viking, decided that he would become a Christian. And again, the chronicle tells us that he called together representatives of all the religions that were around him. And if you look at that first map, you'll notice that right next to the Dnieper Kiev is this huge area called the Kingdom of the Hazars, or the Khazars. And for those of you who are aware of the story, which is partly true and partly legend again, the Hazars had converted to Judaism several centuries before, and the most important teller of that story was the Jewish poet Yehuda Halevi, who wrote the very famous story of Kuzari. Well, just as he tells the story in Kuzari, the primary chronicle tells us that Volodymyr, or Valdemar, depending on what you would like to call him, called together representatives of the various religions in the area. So there was an imam, and there was a rabbi, and there was a priest who represented the Western Church, and there was another representative of the Eastern Church. And according to the legend, The representatives of the Vikings or the Varangians who went to Constantinople were so impressed by the beautiful, huge churches in Constantinople that they decided to go with the classiest religion that they saw, which was Eastern Orthodoxy, or Orthodoxy. There wasn't Eastern Orthodoxy yet. That would come a couple centuries later. And so they became, in effect, Eastern Christians, and in the process adapted what we will call Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The major reason they probably did that was not because the churches were so impressive, but because the Kievan princes tended occasionally to marry princesses from Constantinople. And it would be helpful to be of the same religion, and Constantinople was their most important trading partner. But of course, that's not exciting enough, so the Chronicle doesn't tell the story that way. During the reign of Volodymyr, whatever his name you want to be, son, whom I will call Yaroslav because I don't know how to pronounce it in Ukrainian, Yaroslav, who is known to us as Yaroslav the Wise or Yaroslav Mudry, expanded the Kievan state, and he began to build churches. So the oldest cathedral in that part of Eastern Europe, including all of present-day Russia, was built in Kiev during the reign of Yaroslav Mudry, which extended into the early 10th century and 11th century, and it still stands today in Kiev. It is called Sancta Sophia. It is based on the same church, which is now a mosque, was then Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, as you know from the song. And also they established a very important monastery in Kiev, which is called the Kiev Cave Monastery, or the Kievske Pecherske Lavra in Russian. I don't know the words in Ukrainian. And that's where they wrote the primary chronicle. So the chronicle was written like a couple of hundred years after all the events it describes early on, but that is our first source of Ukrainian or Russian history. The rest of it is archaeology. And it's where every student of Russian history begins when we start studying it seriously as opposed to in college. So if you understand that, you understand why Kiev, for whether you're a Russian or Ukrainian, is the central first city. It's the mother of all cities, and it's as a city probably 450 years older than Moscow. It was the first source of Eastern Orthodox religion. The first metropolitan sat there. So it had all these various influences. And it was also the place to which St. Cyril and Methodius were sent, who were the creators of the Cyrillic alphabet, which is what Russians and Ukrainians, Bulgarians used at first. But this is the source of the language. It's the source for Russians and Ukrainians and Eastern Slavs in general of their writing. And so consequently, Kiev is the center of the dissemination of all of these ideas. The word Ukraine in English stands for the word borderlands, Ukraina, or Ukraina, and that means borders. And in a sense, one of the functions that Ukraine has filled since the 9th century is it's been this border through which other civilizations and ideas seep into these areas of Eastern and Far Eastern, if you want to call it that, Europe. So I'm trying to figure out, are these back to back? Okay, I'm not sure what's on the other side of the next map that we should be looking at is a map of Kievan Rus in the year from 1220 to 1240. Okay? This map, which is on the back of the one that says, doesn't say anything, but this is Muscovy in the 14th century. So This map of Kievan Rus shows you the greatest extension of Kievan Rus. And what happened was that the princes who were organized around Kiev from the time of Yaroslav onwards, in order to solve problems of succession, he handed out principalities around the area to his various sons and relatives of sons. And the expansion of these areas went to the north and to the east, to an area that we call Vladimir and Suzdal. Now, why did I include this map? Because the year 1240 is a very significant one. It's the year the Mongols conquered Kiev. And when the Mongols conquered Kiev in 1240, and the date I actually read is December 7th. I guess it's a fatal date. Anyway, and Kiev fell to the Mongols. One of the most important things that happened was that, in effect, those Slavs who lived to the south and west of Moscow, or Vladimir and Suzdal, became separate from the rulers for Mongol purposes from the northeastern Slavs who lived in the areas of Vladimir Suzdal, which is where Moscow eventually, by the 14th century, became the most important city. And interestingly enough, Kiev at that time diminished in importance because Kiev was actually governed from the western parts of present-day Ukraine. However, the thing that you have to remember is that separation became a very long-standing separation. And the reason for it was because the Muscovite princes collected and paid taxes in this part, in the eastern part, to the Mongol Khan, and those who lived to the west of those areas, from Kiev and west of it, the collector of their taxes came from further to the west, and they paid those taxes to the Mongol Khan, and they were separated from one another. We think that accounts in part for the differences in language, and perhaps maybe why the Ukrainians have an H and the Russians don't. So one of the big differences when you read Ukrainian names and Russian names is where you see a G in Russian is probably an H in Ukrainian. So Ukrainians can actually say ha-ha and Russians say gaga. I'm very serious about this. They say gaga. Anyway, because of that split, it became Moscow that became the unifier of the Russian lands. And so the map on the other side shows you what Muscovy looked like at the end of the 14th century. It was at that time that Moscow became the most important city of all of these cities. And if you were to superimpose this map on the map over here, you would find that most of it isn't, that all the parts, vast parts, including the whole area of the left bank of the Dnieper, are not included. So Moscow and Russia Muscovy began to grow apart, and Kiev was part of what would ultimately become part of the Polish state, and they were governed, and they were quite separate from one another. The Polish state grew, it became the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Russian Muscovite state grew on its own, and very separately from one another. Kiev remained, however, the most important religious city, and it was from Kiev that, and through Kiev, that by the 15th and 16th century, there were all sorts of important religious influences that began to penetrate very, very slowly into Muscovy. Please notice I don't call it Russia. And I should also mention that the word Rus, which is the term that we use for the Kievan state up until the 13th century, is a word that denotes Vikings. That's what the Slavs called the Vikings. They called them the Rus or the Ros, which is how the term developed. Anyway, let's see what we have here. In the middle of the 17th century, I'm not allowed to move, I forgot. When I teach, I move, I'm sorry. In the middle of the 17th century, at the time that the area that we would call Ukraine was part of this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, there were large numbers of peasants who were led by groups that we call the Cossacks. Now, the Cossacks weren't exactly peasants. They were serfs who had escaped and moved to areas where nobody could get to them. And there were two major groups of Cossacks. Some of them were on the Don, which is not part of our story, but the others were in an area called Zaporozhye, which is part of southern and western Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, pardon me. My husband is a geographer, and I drive him crazy because he knows that I don't know east from west. So you'll have to forgive me, eastern Ukraine. And there was the very notorious Cossack who rebelled against the Polish landlords and their agents. And the agents of the Polish landlords by the 17th century were Jews. And so in the year 1648, a major rebellion against the Polish rulers and the Polish landlords began in the eastern parts of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that only was really settled in 1654, and then by a very formal treaty called the Truce of Andrusovo in 1667. And according to that treaty, the entire east bank of the Dnieper, which includes the city of Kiev, was ceded to the Muscovite state of Alexis Mikhailovich. And this is the first time that Muscovy actually controls areas of what we would call Ukraine. And this is the east bank of the Ukraine. And this is the first time that Russia may have a trickle of Jews. Not too many, because most of them lived further to the west. And so this is a very important moment. And the year that it commemorates is really 1654, less so 1667. And the reason that's important is in 1954, Khrushchev, in order to commemorate the 300th anniversary of anything Russian getting parts of Ukraine, gave Crimea to the Ukraine, never expecting that the Soviet Union would fall apart. However, what most of us know, I mean, if I were to ask me, how many of your ancestors, in my case it's my parents, came from what we would generally call the Russian Empire? How many of them were Russian Jews, right? Quite a few. Today they might be called Ukrainian Jews. My parents thought they were Russian Jews. Neither of them came from what we would call Russia. My mother comes from Belarus. She comes from a city called Gomel. And my father came from a city called Rovna, which is smack dab in Ukraine. But they thought they were Russian Jews. They didn't know it. They didn't know any better because they came from the empire. The crucial thing that happens in the 18th century during the reign of Catherine the Great is that the Russian Empire first participates in 3 partitions of Poland. The first one was in 1772. The second occurred in 1793, and the third in 1795. And this map of the partitions of Poland, which is on the other side of the Truce of Andrusovo map, shows you how Poland was split. It was split by the Austrian Empire under Maria Theresa, by the Prussian Kingdom under Frederick the Great, and by the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great. So 2 women and a man. Anyhow, the first partition brought into what you're really interested in, this greenish stuff, okay? The rest of it belongs to either Prussia or Austria. But in the greenish stuff, the first dark green is the first partition, and that's mostly parts of Belarus. The big green one, lighter green, that's when Russia got most of her Jews. And then the second and the third partition is this lighter green when they finished it off. Other areas, the Austrians accumulated these areas in the south, and the Prussians accumulated blue on this map. So it's only at the end of the 18th century that Russia acquires most of the areas that include the Ukraine. Poland is no more, at least until the time of Napoleon, which is only 20 years later. And most of Russia acquires her Jewish population at the end of the 18th century and begins to develop all the policies that we hear about during the course of the 18th and 19th centuries toward Jews. The next map that I want to show you, one of my maps is not here. And if not, I'll find it in my black and white maps. The next map is a map. Oh, that's not particularly helpful. Let me, Connie, can you give me my folder? I don't think there are a couple of maps that I sent out here. So I'll show this to you and we can pass it around. At the same time, at the end of the 18th century, the Russians did something else. They engaged in a series of wars with the Turks. They had a war every century with the Turks. Couldn't be a good century without a war with the Turks. But at the end of the 18th century, they had at least 2 and possibly 3. And these were very successful wars against the Turks because during the reign of Catherine, they acquired the Crimea and the entire area around the Black Sea. These areas were not ever really part of Ukraine until, and they were administered separately until the beginning of the 20th century. And these areas of Ukraine were called New Russia. They included what is today the port city of Odessa, the port city of Nikolaev, many of the areas that Mariupol. So the parts of the Ukraine that are being most hotly contested by the Russians are these areas of New Russia that were acquired from the Turks at the end of the 18th century. Now, why is this important? It's important for a whole series of reasons, and that includes the Crimea. These were areas that, for example, became populated by Ukrainian speakers later on, but they were controlled by the empire and governed in a very different way. And the difference in that government was actually very important throughout the late 19th century and up until the time of the Russian Revolution. This is a map, which you don't have, which is actually my favorite map. It's the simplest, okay, and we'll pass it around. And it shows you what was added to Ukraine and when. And that's what I would like to speak about in this next segment. The other map that I think you do you have a map of the Pale of Settlement in your collection? Okay. To find which one it is. Okay. That's the top map, first map, right? The thing about the Pale of Settlement is, as most of you know, Jews were required to live in certain areas of Russia, and they were not permitted to live unless they had special permits in most of the Russian Empire. And the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were forced to live, and actually where they did live, coincided largely with areas of Ukraine, Lithuania, parts of what we would call Latvia today, which were called Courland in those days, and they were allowed to live in New Russia, areas to which they were able to settle. So, for example, I used to do this spiel on the history of Odessa many years ago, and Odessa is a relatively new city. It became an important city in Russia only in the 18th century, and Jews were permitted to live there, and many of the Jews who came to live there weren't Russian Jews, they came from Romania. And Odessa was an open port, it was a very unusual place. But the point is that throughout the history of the 19th century with the establishment of the Pale of Settlement during the reign of Nicholas I, de facto they allowed Jews to live in all these new territories that had been acquired at the end of the 18th century. And there were certain cities, for example, where Jews could not live until they were punishing somebody. So, for example, the Poles rebelled against the Russians in 1862, and to punish them, they allowed Jews to come and live in Warsaw, and they allowed Jews to come and live in Kiev, because we were a punishment. So consequently, all of this area was very unusual because Jews could move throughout this area freely, whereas Russians, most of whom were either serfed or had been enserfed or were just emancipated from their serfdom in 1861, could only move with permission, whereas Jews could move anywhere that they wanted to within the Pale of Settlement. To live outside, you had to have special situation, like you had to be super rich, or you had to have a profession that was lacking. So the Pale of Settlement actually includes all of Ukraine, parts of all of Belarus, Lithuania, and later on Poland, as it was acquired by the Russian state after the Napoleonic Wars. One of the things that Putin has complained about was that the Soviets, after the revolution, in creating the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, created this thing called the Ukrainian SSR. Now, Ukrainian nationalism was a development of the 19th century, much like Jewish nationalism, which we would call Zionism today. Nationalism in general, if you teach European history, is a 19th century phenomenon. And in the case of Ukraine, as it starts with Jews as well, people begin to develop their own language. So the Ukrainian language was basically the language of the peasants spoke. If you lived in the city where very few peasants lived, you spoke Russian, because the cities in the Russian Empire were Russian-speaking cities. Moreover, in the late 19th century, the desire to Russify the empire was very, very strong. So even in Poland, you couldn't teach Polish. You had to teach children Russian. The Poles didn't like it much. And so, for example, in the case of my parents, my mother was born in 1904, my father probably around the end of 1900, maybe 1901. They changed the calendar. He changed his birthday a lot. They went to school and they learned Russian. If you went to a government school or a private school in the empire, you learned Russian. And my father, as I said, was born in what is present-day Ukraine, in a city that's fairly far west. But he never heard Ukrainian, from what he told me, because he lived in an urban environment, and Russian was a language that was spoken in an urban environment. Peasants spoke the languages Ukrainian, Belarusian, Latvian, Lithuanian. Those were peasant languages. And it was only at the end of the 19th century that we really begin to see the development of interest in those languages. Yiddish, for example, becomes a written language at the end of the 19th century. And it becomes a literary language instead of the jargon, as it was called, precisely at the same time. And the Ukrainians developed their own historians, their own writers at the same time, at the end of the 19th century, during a time when it became important for different groups to recognize their national identities. Now, the communists, the Bolsheviks, I don't want to call them communists yet, the revolutionary parties recognized in their opposition to the Tsarist state the importance of developing, of speaking to national aspirations. And after the revolution of 1917, a number of very important things happened. As you may recall, or you should know, the Russian revolutions, there were two, in 1917 took place during World War I. And the Germans occupied the vast territories of Ukraine. The German armies, particularly after peace negotiations began with the Germans in January of 1918, when Trotsky declared no war, no peace, so the Germans said, fine, we'll advance, and they did. Took over most of Ukraine and Belarus. And consequently, at that time, they encouraged the development of a Ukrainian national state. And even at the 1919 Peace Conference in Paris, there was a Ukrainian map that was presented at the Peace Conference as a model for the Ukraine. And there was a kind of a government that was established. However, the Poles weren't too fond of this idea. The White Russians were contesting these areas, and the Bolshevik armies, which were called the Red Armies, were contesting these areas. And Kiev, for example, was a very important area of that contestation and fighting. And by the time the Russian war against Poland ended, the Russian Civil War ended in 1921, there was no Ukraine anymore. There was no independent entity as Ukraine. But for the purposes of creating this union of Soviet Socialist republics, the Bolsheviks created a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, just as they did of a Belarusian Socialist Soviet Republic and various republics to the east, which I fondly call the stands. And this map shows you how present-day Ukraine was created in that period. So, this central area, it says in big letters, Ukraine, 1654. I'll pass this around. And it shows you when different places were added. In 1922, at the time of the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, this whole area that includes the areas of present-day Donbass and this whole area which is the Black Sea littoral, along the Black Sea, was created and added to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. There were a lot of Ukrainians who lived there, many Ukrainian speakers, although the vast majority of the speakers here were probably Russian speakers. And it was convenient because they had to be administered, and this was a very good way of administering it. Crimea got added in 1954 to celebrate, or something or other, the 300th anniversary of the first annexation. And then during World War II, the areas of the western Ukraine, that includes the city of Lviv today, which was called Lvov by the Russians, which the Austrians called Lemberg, and the Poles called Lwów. It's the same place. This whole area was added at the time during World War II and following World War II. And so modern-day Ukraine got created in this manner. And so when Putin talks about how the Bolsheviks artificially created Ukraine out of pieces of Russia, this is what he's talking about. In 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, fell apart, whatever verb you'd like to use, there was a referendum in Ukraine. 90% of the population voted, or 85% of the population voted, and approximately 90% of the people who voted to separate themselves from Russia, from the Soviet Union. So in some ways, the creation of Ukraine today is based on a referendum that included 90% of the eligible voters in Ukraine. And so you could argue that there's a real basis for its existence as a separate country. Ukraine historically has had problems with its Russian rulers. Not the most recent, but one of the most recent of which occurred in the 1930s. In the 1930s, as the Soviet Union began to collectivize, it collectivized the farmers, not the peasant farmers, not only in Russia but in Ukraine. And in the process of collectivization, many of the animals that peasants owned, and this was a phenomenon throughout the Soviet Union, were slaughtered rather than being given up to the state and creation of collective farms. And one of the things that the Soviet state did was they confiscated the grain. And in the process of confiscating the grain, they created a famine, which the Ukrainians call the Holodomor. And in the process, somewhere between 4, 5, 6 million Ukrainians died between 1931, 32, 33, 34, 35, under Soviet control. And most of those who died were peasants. And this is something that the Ukrainians have not forgotten. For them, the Holodomor is like the equivalent of the greatest tragedy of Ukrainian history, and it came under Russian rule. So even though they were part of the USSR, the elites always spoke Russian, one of the things that the Soviets did was they permitted the study in the various republics of their languages. So one of the things, when I was at Columbia as a graduate student, we had a Soviet nationalities project. I remember going to one of the lectures when they were talking about how people in Belarusia started learning a language they had never spoken before, called Belarusian. And since my mother was from there, I asked her when I came home from school one day, because I lived at home when I was a graduate student, I said, "You lived on the outskirts of the town. How many of the peasants spoke Belarusian?" She said, "What are you talking about? They all spoke Russian." And they lived right where peasants lived. So one of the things that the Russians did was that the Soviets did was they created the opportunity, I guess I should stop, for people to study different languages, their native languages. They did that for Jews too. They created a place called Birobidzhan, which was a Jewish enclave for Jews. It was right next to China because that's where Jews had always lived. And the official language of Birobidzhan was Yiddish, but it was written in Cyrillic letters. So this was part of a larger trend. But what it did do, not so much for the Jews, but very much for the Ukrainians, was it solidified their identities. And so none of this should be a very big surprise to us, that when given the opportunity to leave Russian control, a vast majority of Ukrainians, including Russian-speaking Ukrainians, chose to do so. And so this is the setting for which we have this war. A war which, if you read some of what Putin has said, is a war where he has been attempting throughout to, not sure, take over Ukraine, destroy it, and now that he hasn't been able to do that, probably solidify controls that they've tried to take since 2014 of the eastern areas and probably the entire port area, all the ports around the Black Sea, and turn Ukraine into a landlocked nation. How successful they're going to be is hard to tell. A couple of weeks ago, I said they were probably doing well. Now they're doing badly. So I can't tell you anyway. I'm not trained to forecast anything anyway. But I hope, if nothing else, what I've been able to explain to you today is that it's a phenomenon. It's an important phenomenon to understand. But Ukraine has a kind of a legitimacy as a state. And the greatest threat it was to Putin was not so much that it wanted to join NATO. It was because it wanted to be part of the European Union. And there's nothing more threatening to the Russians than a successful, gradually less corrupt Ukrainian state with a working democratic system that might actually join the European Union and be part of Western commerce and society, sitting right next to a Russian state which is growing more and more isolated from Western Europe and more and more totalitarian. I can't tell you anything more, but I hope it helps you understand a little bit. And I hope I haven't gone on too long, which I probably have, so I apologize. Are there any questions? Yeah, Jeff?
Can I take what you said and summarize it so I make sure I'm understanding correctly?
Yeah.
In that, if you go back to the early history of what do you want to call it, Rus? Or the Vikings and all that put together, you have a common origin story in terms of what you want to call Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Use modern terms. of Russia and Ukraine, and there are strands in there that are separate and independent.
Yeah.
That's both ways.
Yeah, I would just simply argue that the Ukrainian story precedes the Russian story and makes the Russian story. And I would say, my argument would be, and it's a facetious argument as you can tell, that essentially Kiev precedes Moscow in terms of its importance, and it's in a sense it's Kiev that determined Moscow in many ways, because it was the center. By the way, I have a friend who was a graduate student of Yale, who's a student of a very close friend of mine with whom I was a graduate student in Columbia, and one of the things that he has studied very seriously is the path of certain kinds of ideas that came into Russia through Kiev. Kiev was the point into the Russian state, whether it was Muscovy or later on the Russian Empire, through which many of the ideas came, because after all, Ukraine is border.
But what you're saying there really has the opposite effect. You're saying Kiev is the mother of Russia.
Yeah.
And so therefore, they should all be linked in one half of the union.
That's true, but it should be from Ukraine, not from Moscow. Well, that's the problem.
That argument there really indirectly supports Putin.
It does, but it doesn't. It does if you want to make that argument that Russia has a right to Ukraine, then there's an argument to be made that the entire international order that has prevailed since 1945 can be overturned because somebody doesn't feel like it respects some other state.
Right. There's something for either to hang their hat on.
Yes.
But you've got to look to the more modern evolution, especially the post-Russian Revolution evolution.
Yeah.
In terms of how, no matter what this historic thing, Kiev being the mother of Russia, whatever, they have evolved to now.
Yeah.
And to now they're separate no matter what stance they're going on.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I'm very sympathetic to your point of view because I'm a Russianist. I'm not a Ukrainianist.
Right.
And several years ago, there was the same friend of mine who was studying Kiev was part of the people who created an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art about Kiev. And so he took me and my husband and my cousin Ray, and we went to the Met. And my friend Nikos has a very loud, booming voice. I mean, really loud and booming. And being good Russianist, everything we saw, he said in Russian and very loud. And there were all these people somebody had to come over him and say, you can't speak so loudly, you're insulting people. Because there are many people who are Ukrainians who don't like the name Vladimir, it's Volodymyr. People who don't want to say Kiev, who want to say Kiev. For them, and at the time I remember being very angry at them because to me as a Russianist, this was the origin of the country I have studied and devoted my life to. I'm much less sympathetic to that argument now.